So I'd like to thank both the Pharos Foundation and its research director, Dr. Daniel Robinson, for the great opportunity and privilege of speaking to you in beautiful Worcester College, Oxford this evening. The title of this second lecture is Carl Schmitt, Political Theology and the History of Political Thought. In the previous lecture, we looked at Schmitt as a political historian, above all in relation to Schmitt's propagandistic history of the First World War and Germany's defeat in that war, state composition, and the collapse of the Second Empire from 1934. In the present lecture, I'm going to discuss two big topics related to Carl Schmitt: Carl Schmitt's view of political theology and Carl Schmitt's view of the history of political thought, neither of which, to my knowledge, are adequately treated in the secondary literature on Schmitt, and both of which pose big questions of how we might think about politics, theology, history, tradition, and the relation between them. I'd like to open the present lecture with a question about political theology. What does Carl Schmitt mean when he talks about political theology? What is political theology for Schmitt? So many writers, including the Harvard history professor Peter Gordon and the Yale law professor Samuel Moyn, many writers associate Schmitt's use of the concept political theology with the opening sentence of the third chapter of Schmitt's book from 1922 and 1934. And this is the first citation on your handout at the very top of the page when you flip past the cartoons on the front page. Quote, "All pregnant concepts of modern state theory, or all salient concepts of modern state theory, are secularized theological concepts," end quote. In associating the term political theology with this first sentence of the third chapter of the book of that title, these writers, Moyn and Gordon, but they're not alone, make Schmitt's notion of political theology a concept or topos about secularization. On this view, political theology is a thesis about how theological concepts were secularized into modern state theory. One sees this, for example, in Gordon's Migrants in the Profane, where he treats political theology in Schmitt as shorthand for Schmitt's theory of secularization. But let's pause for a moment. If we look back at that first citation on the handout, let's pause for a moment. The term political theology is absent from that passage, and indeed from that very sentence. Carl Schmitt is not explicitly or even implicitly defining political theology in that sentence or in that passage. Now, Carl Schmitt was eminently capable of a sharp conceptual definition when he wished to provide one. Carl Schmitt defines the state in the late Weimar period as the political unity of a people, die politische Einheit eines Volkes. It is because the state, on Schmitt's definition, is the political unity of a people that Schmitt holds the first sentence of the concept of the political in the 1932 edition of that book to be something like an analytic proposition. Quote, "The concept of the state presupposes the concept of the political," end quote. Not least because for Schmitt, and on Schmitt's definition, as we talked about last week, the word political is part of his definition of the term state. So how should we understand what Schmitt means by political theology? What is his definition of the term? Interestingly, or perhaps surprisingly, one would search the text of political theology in both the 1922 and 1934 editions. One would search the text of political theology in vain for a sharp conceptual definition of the term. Within the text of Political Theology, the book, the term political theology itself is undefined. How then are we to understand what Schmitt is up to with this term? What is Schmitt doing in talking about political theology? Is political theology a kind of gestalt onto which readers and commentators are to project their own understandings and interpretations, or does Schmitt mean something quite concrete by the idea and by the term? Some readers, and this is if we go on to citations 2 and 3 of the handout, some readers have tried to work out Schmitt's concept of political theology by proposing conceptual definitions of their own which fit or seem to fit with Schmitt's usage of political theology. The German philosopher Heinrich Meyer, for example, in a famous essay from the early 1990s, Was ist politische Theologie? What is political theology? Defined political theology both in Schmitt's usage and for any writer who appropriates the concept or appropriates the term. Meyer defined political theology as being, and this is citation 3 on the handout, a political theory, doctrine, or teaching grounded in a belief in divine revelation. That's the third citation on the handout. In associating this definition with Schmitt, Meyer was boldly asserting not only that Schmitt was a believer, but also a believer in revelation and in the prerequisites for revelation, in a deity who could work miracles, who had the attribute of omnipotence, and who could reverse physical and perhaps even mathematical laws. Now there are, if we look on to citation 4 on the handout, there are places and passages within Schmitt's corpus which lend weight and heft to this reading of Schmitt. In der Wert des Staates, the value of the state, in chapter 3, and this is citation 4 on your handout, Schmitt does attribute both the capacity for omnipotence, which is itself, you could say, the prerequisite for divine revelation. Schmitt does attribute that capacity to God in citation 4. Yet, like the reading by the American historians, Meyer's conceptual definition is not to be found explicitly in Schmitt's book, Political Theology. Later in life, both in the 1955 Festschrift for Ernst Junger on Junger's 60th birthday, in his own person, writing in his own person, and in the voice of his characters, in his dialogue on New Space, Schmitt would claim sharply that, quote, an historical truth is only true once. And that is both citations 5 and citation 6 on the handout. And historical truth is only true once. Schmitt writes in accord with this maxim. When the historical situation changes, Schmitt rewrites his texts, rephrases his maxims, and deletes passages from his prior public works and published works upon their republication. This is a feature that the English language translations of Schmitt do not fully attend to. Writing at the outset of the National Socialist edition of Political Theology in 1934, Schmitt opened his preface to the second edition of that work with a lie, or at best with a half-truth. Quote, and this is the 7th citation on your handout, this second edition of Political Theology has remained unaltered, end quote. Yet the half-truth was swiftly qualified. Quote, some excisions consist only in striking passages which treated unessential, unwesentliche, unessential matters, end quote. Amongst those unessential matters in the passages which Schmitt struck out from the 1934 edition of Political Theology were passages from the 1922 edition, which had treated or cited authors of Jewish origin. Now, where does this leave us with understanding Schmitt's concept or definition of political theology? What is political theology for Schmitt? In the very next paragraph of the 1934 preface to Political Theology, Schmitt notes, and this is still citation 7 on your handout, Schmitt notes that since the original publication of his Political Theology in 1922, quote, in the meantime, we have recognized the political as the total, and consequently also know that the decision about whether something is unpolitical always signifies a political decision, irrespective of who makes it and with what grounds of proof it clothes itself, end quote. To what extent is it accurate to think Schmitt's concept of political theology in 1934 as inflected by his definition of the political from 1927 and 1932? In this view, or on this interpretation, political theology would be that theology or that account of God or of the divine, which distinguishes between friends and enemies, and that theology which partakes of the most intense grouping between human beings. To what extent, however, does this term, the term political theology itself, remain a mystery within Schmitt's corpus, a mystery perhaps reflecting the mystery of the divine? In what follows, I would ask that you bear this alternate understanding, the understanding of political theology as being charged with the friend-enemy distinction, bear this alternate understanding of Schmitt's political theology in mind. So congratulations, you've made it through the first part of the talk. Part 2, Carl Schmitt and the history of political thought. A recent edition of the first authorized English translation of Carl Schmitt's The Tyranny of Values reprints a number of Schmitt's works on geopolitics and post-World War II apologetics for Nazism, alongside a series of Schmitt's short essays on major figures in the history of political thought, ranging across Machiavelli, Baudin, Hobbes, and Rousseau. These later texts display Schmitt at work as a writer on the history of political thought, and thus it is a potentially interesting and not unimportant question to consider what Schmitt may be up to when writing on major figures within this tradition. What does it mean to do the history of political thought? What is the history of political thought? And what was Carl Schmitt doing when writing about figures like Machiavelli, Baudin, Hobbes, and Rousseau? And you have, actually on the cover of your handout, you have Schmitt's late short essay from June of 1962, his late essay on Rousseau on the cover. So if you flip back to the cartoon, if you want to see below the cartoon, you have Schmitt's essay on Rousseau. As an approach to these questions, we might get a better sense of what Schmitt is doing by looking to several conceptions of how one might go about writing the history of political thought, which however much Schmitt respects or disrespects them, Carl Schmitt does not adopt. In the first instance, one might think of the history of political thought as intimately bound up with state theory. State theory in the sense in which the history of political thought is primarily the activity of telling a story of the genesis or coming into being of the modern state. This is something which one may see in parts of the German tradition of the history of political thought, in Johann Caspar Bluntschli, for example, and in a different way in Friedrich Meinecke. Both these writers place a theory of the state or an idea of reason of state within a longer, perhaps teleological trajectory, which terminates in an account of the modern or contemporary state as it is or as that state should be. Second, one might think of the history of political thought in a Rankian mode, one which aims to relate the history of political thought as the history of ideas or theories or texts within contexts, and to relate this history as it actually occurred. One could think of one mode of Rankian history as modeled, consciously or unconsciously, on editorial scholarship. Editorial scholarship in this vein aims at authoritativeness, of producing editions of texts complete in their variants and thorough in their notes, and perhaps so exhaustively precise as to render the production of further editions of the same texts superfluous. However much Schmitt admired or valued this second type of scholarship, and if you can see an instance of his admiration for it in citation 8 on your handout, however much Schmitt admired or valued this second type of scholarship, editorial scholarship, which to a certain extent Schmitt's anonymous post-war review praising the editorial scholarship of both Norberto Bobbio in Italy and Michael Oakeshott. So Bobbio in the 1940s, late 1940s, does an edition of De Cive, and Hobbes, Oakeshott of Hobbes' De Cive, and Oakeshott does immediate post-war edition of Leviathan with Blackwell, so a kind of Oxonian edition of Hobbes. And that's citation 8 on your handout. This project of editorial scholarship was not a project to which Schmitt devoted the preponderance of his work as a legal and political thinker, writing about inherited figures and inherited themes. Third, one might conceive of an Nietzschean paradigm of writing the history of political thought. Political thought modeled on the history of art. One might think of the history of political thought done as a form of monumental history, narrating the achievements of grand masters, exemplified in great works or great books, or slightly differently, a Platonic model which understands the history of political thought primarily as the history of political philosophy and understands it also to be in certain respects quite similar to the history of mathematics. And we get an example of that in citation 9 on your handout. On this latter view, which Leo Strauss seemed to avow in his lectures on Nietzsche's Zarathustra late in his career at the University of Chicago, it is only those who are to some degree mathematicians who are qualified to write the history of mathematics, and similarly only those who are to some extent philosophers who are competent to write the history of philosophy, including political philosophy. And that's citation 9 on your handout. Now, none of these modes of doing the history of political thought, neither the state theoretical model of Bluntschli and Meinecke, nor Rankian textual scholarship, nor Nietzschean monumental history, nor Plato-inspired history of mathematics, none of these models is Carl Schmitt's. Carl Schmitt was doing something different when he wrote on figures like Machiavelli and Hobbes, and doing something different when he composed his world historical meditation, Land and Sea. For Schmitt, the writing of the history of political thought is primarily a mode of doing politics by other means. The political, for Schmitt, is about the decisive grouping of humans at the highest degree of pitched intensity. The political is, at least potentially, about the fight to the death in war or revolution between friends and enemies. To understand Schmitt's conception of politics and the political, one has to flesh out Schmitt's understanding of enmity and friendship. What, for Schmitt, is friendship? Is friendship a relationship based on a shared commonality, something two persons hold in common together? So, for example, if Radar and I hold Deleuze in common, are we friends in relation to Deleuze? Is friendship a relationship based on a shared commonality, something two persons hold in common together? Or is friendship a relationship defined against an external other or outsider? A relationship between two people in a common phalanx? Or a relationship between two people who happen to be in the same territory when that territory is attacked? Who is a friend? Who are Schmitt's friends, and how does he relate to them? The friend, as many scholars have noted, may appear to be an undefined term in Schmitt's political thought. Nonetheless, in his 2009 biography, Carl Schmitt, Aufstieg und Fall, I think this is citation 10 on your handout, Aufstieg und Fall, Reinhard Mehring describes figures in the history of political thought as Schmitt writes it as identification figures. That's citation 10 on your handout. In Schmitt's hands, Schmitt's Tocqueville, Schmitt's Machiavelli, Schmitt's Donoso Cortez become versions of Schmitt himself. Here, noting Schmitt's praise in his Machiavelli article for quote, and this is quotation 12 on your handout, noting Schmitt's praise in his Machiavelli article for the systematic learnedness, I guess that's not in the quote, of Aristotle, who has a role in Schmitt's world history, a history from which Plato and Hobbes are notably absent. So Schmitt absents Plato and Hobbes from Land and Sea. One might say that when Schmitt writes the history of political thought, Schmitt thinks of his friends in the terms of the definition of friendship deployed by Aristotle in books 8 and 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics, an annotated copy of which was present in Schmitt's library upon his death, and that's citation 11 on your handout. So Schmitt's library, when Schmitt dies, he has only books 8 and 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics, so only the friendship books are in his library, and that's the citation from the library catalog of Schmitt's books in the Nachlass. Schmitt has only books 8 and 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Friendship for Schmitt is the sum of ethics. On the Aristotelian view, the friend is another myself. The relation of philia is a relation of self-identification with the friend. The friend, on this view, is another me. When Schmitt writes about Machiavelli, Rousseau, and Hobbes, these figures become other versions of himself, and vehicles or stalking horses for the advancement of Schmitt's preferred politics and Schmitt's preferred policies. Schmitt's Machiavelli is deployed to advance his Weimar-era support for Mussolini, with Schmitt using the piece to praise the fascist dictator and to assert falsely within his Machiavelli article, and this is citation 12 on your handout, quote, Mussolini, the most conscious enemy of a state-liquidating liberalism, was awarded a doctorate in Bologna in 1924 for a dissertation on Machiavelli, end quote. The editor of the German edition of the text, of this text in Schmitt's collected papers, Gunther Maschke, marks this as Schmitt's error, claiming that Mussolini long entertained writing a dissertation on the concept of the statesman in the work of Machiavelli, but eventually abandoned the idea. The German editor further claims that in 1923, the University of Bologna offered Mussolini an honorary doctorate, which Mussolini then refused. Yet error or no error, the analysis of this quotation in which Schmitt mobilizes his reading of Machiavelli to praise Mussolini, and containing what for Schmitt amounts to superlative praise, the most conscious enemy of state-dissolving liberalism, that's conspicuously absent from prior scholarly discussions of Schmitt as a reader of Machiavelli. Hobbes, too, in the post-war piece 300 Years Leviathan, becomes an identification figure or vehicle for the transmission of Hobbes' own views. In the immediate post-war period, Schmitt circulated widely an anonymous newspaper article entitled Amnesty or the Force of Forgetting, in which Schmitt advocated a general amnesty for all crimes committed by the Nazi regime and its servants, not least himself, modeled on the Act of Oblivion, which accompanied the restoration of the Stuarts and the end of the English Republic in the 1660s. And the Act of Oblivion actually criminalized speech talking about the interregnum. So it's criminalized the discussion of crimes during the time, which actually, and if you take that as the model, the parallel with World War II becomes clear. Indeed, in this piece, Schmitt praises Hobbes because the philosopher was, quote, and this is citation 13 on your handout, it's a long citation, there's both the German and the English in the citation. If you go down a few lines, about 6 lines, you get the translation. The philosopher was, quote, the first who declared the retroactivity of penal law to be unjust and who overcame the natural legal obfuscation of this principle. Hobbes's more fortunate rival, John Locke, came a generation later, when the Civil War was over and the situation had again become normal. There are happy times in which it is easy to construct a free commonwealth. One should rejoice in such times, but one should not vilify those who, in harder times, seek to save what can be saved, end quote. Schmitt's immediate post-war Hobbes is particularly keen on opposing ex post facto laws, a class of legislation which included, in Schmitt's opinion, the crimes against humanity, of which many of the Nuremberg defendants were convicted, as well as the crime of aggression, which the lawyers at Nuremberg considered charging Schmitt himself with. It is one thrust of the entirety of the historical argument of Schmitt's 1950 tome, The Nomos of the Earth, that aggression is not, and has never been, a crime in international law, which is particularly convenient for Schmitt, who might potentially have been charged with a subclass of this crime, intellectual preparation of aggressive war, geistige Vorbereitung des Angriffskrieges, at Nuremberg. Similarly, Schmitt's Rousseau, going to our frontispiece from our handout today, similarly, Schmitt's Rousseau is a figure of self-identification. And you can turn to the front of your handout. In his 1962 article, True Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Schmitt Germanizes Rousseau's name to Johann Jakob, and you can see that very clearly. This is the version that's in the Library of Congress, so you can go to America to get your Schmitt. To the true Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but to the true Johann Jakob Rousseau, and Schmitt claims Rousseau as a forebear for post-colonial movements in Algeria, Vietnam, and implicitly in Germany itself, when occupied and divided between what Schmitt regarded as occupying forces in both the East and the West. Schmitt's Rousseau, like Schmitt himself, emphasizes the importance of homogeneous social groups and the limits to technology and trade. Schmitt writes of Rousseau that, quote, he saw, and this is citation 14 on your handout, but it's kind of on the furthest right, the rightmost column in the frontispiece, of the 5 columns, it's the one furthest to the right, the 5th column, as it were. Schmitt's Rousseau, like Schmitt himself, emphasizes the importance of homogeneous social groups and the limits to technology and trade. Schmitt writes of Rousseau, and this is in column 5 near the bottom, but also citation 14 on the handout, quote, Rousseau saw the progress of trade and industry, but he also held this progress for a great misfortune. Freedom and equality exist for Rousseau only in small, modest, homogeneous constructs. Everything else is illusion and deception, end quote. From this description of Rousseau as a theorist of homogeneity, Schmitt concludes, this is the true Rousseau. Having looked briefly at how Schmitt relates to his friends in the history of political thought, namely as identification figures, let us briefly consider how Schmitt regards his enemies and what he would do with them. For Schmitt, the enemy, unlike the friend, is defined. The enemy is, in Schmitt's terms, in the concept of the political, quote, the other, the foreigner, the one who seeks to negate one's own existence and way of life existentially, and the one on whom and against whom one wages war with the aim of doing all that pertains to war. For Schmitt, concepts, political terminology, interpretation, and authoritative texts are weapons. Each potentially and actually can be used in conflict to maintain order internally and to project power and strength externally. With regard to those he views as enemies, particularly in his polemical World History, Land and Sea, but also in his 1938 tract, Leviathan in the State Theory of Thomas Hobbes, Schmitt has a preferred strategy which can be understood either in terms of military combat, fighting on the battlefield, or in terms of legal combat, fighting in the law courts. Schmitt has a preferred strategy of combating those he regards as his enemies. Schmitt favors the strategy of using the weapons of those he regarded as his enemies against those enemies themselves. This strategy consists in Schmitt deploying the Talmud against the Jewish people, the Lutheran Bible and Protestant biblical scholarship against German Protestants, claims of humanity against human rights lawyers, and English histories of piracy against the British effort to classify U-boat warfare as an act of piracy. The first of these strategies can be seen, perhaps most frighteningly, in section 3 of Schmitt's 1942 tract, Land and Sea, A World Historical Meditation, in which Schmitt deploys passages of Talmud and verses of Hannah to present the Jewish people as falling outside his conception of the human. In that work, the first sentence reads, "The human is a land animal, a land dweller, a land treader, ein Landtreter. Those whose existence is based upon the sea, and those who lack a land or recognize national homeland are, in Schmitt's terms, cast outside the category of the human, no longer subject to the protection that law may afford them, and in Schmitt's view, liable to be killed arbitrarily." A similar tactic is pursued by Schmitt against the English and the British in the Second World War. In Roman law and in the Jus Gentium, which Schmitt identified with Völkerrecht, which we might call the law of nations, the law of peoples, piracy is defined with reference to a specific notion of enmity. The pirate, as Schmitt was well aware, is legally defined as a hostis generis humani, as the enemy of humankind. In his writings in the 1930s and 1940s, Schmitt was attuned to American and British attempts during and after the First World War to define the attacks of German U-boats upon American and British commercial vessels as acts of piracy, and thus as acts inimical to humanity. To this end, Schmitt followed closely the international negotiations related to the London Protocol, the London Naval Treaty of 1930, and the Neon Agreement, international protocols which attempted to fix the status of submarine attacks on commercial vessels as violations of the law of nations, often in terms which the Jus Gentium had reserved for acts of piracy. In Land and Sea, it is not German U-boats, but the English people as a whole who are demarcated as pirates, with Schmitt claiming that the English turned to a maritime existence, quote, transformed a people of shepherds into pirates, end quote. Schmitt's redescription of the English as pirates is in keeping with his classification of the English as a Seevolk, a sea people. So Schmitt describes the English throughout his Land and Sea as a Seevolk, a sea people. And rhetorically, Schmitt turns the whole of the English people into hostes generis humani, thus manipulating the concept of piracy against those who would deploy it against the Germans and against U-boat warfare. So this is the strategy of manipulating or using the weapons of the enemy against the enemy themselves. Importantly here, as in Schmitt's treatment of the Jewish people, Schmitt relies on the texts and conceptual weaponry of his proclaimed enemies to pursue his war against them. In the piracy passages in section 8 of Land and Sea, this is from page 41 onwards in the 2015 Telos edition, Schmitt has very, very liberally borrowed the entirety of his account of the Killigrew family of Cornwall from Philip Gossa's History of Piracy, published in London in 1932. What is most interesting about this borrowing is not that it is a flagrant case of plagiarism, which it is, but that it is plagiarism with a martial purpose. Schmitt is using an English history book, which he cites explicitly in other publications in the period, to turn the charge of piracy against the English people themselves. Carl Schmitt's approach to reading his enemies in the history of political thought and in political theory is no less on display in his late engagement with the work of Hannah Arendt. And that will be citations 15 to 17 on your handout. As Schmitt reads the British histories of piracy during the Second World War, and as Schmitt reads Spinoza and Friedrich Julius Stahl in the period in which he propagandized and defended the Nuremberg laws, about which the next lecture will discuss, Schmitt reads Hannah Arendt in the first instance as an enemy. Writing in the diary that would become his posthumous glossarium on 8 September of 1951, Schmitt notes, quote, and this is citation 15 on your handout, this is a Schmitt diary entry, and there's both the German and then my translation. On Hannah Arendt, there is nothing more lost than a European Jew outside the ghetto. In his anxiety, he calls his lack of verecundia, i.e. lack of shame, lack of modesty, he calls his lack of verecundia, lack of shame, lack of modesty, scientificity, poor, lost, emancipado. Schmitt's assault does not primarily target Arendt as a woman, but rather as an emancipado, so he genders her male, because der Jude is male, gendered male. Schmitt targets Arendt as a Jew. Continuing on in this vein, in a diary entry positioned in the glossarium between the entries dated 22 December 1951 and 12 January 1952, Schmitt writes, quote, and this is citation 16 on your handout, quote, first sentence of the year 1952, and he's now quoting from Origins of Totalitarianism. This fright before a species of men whom human pride and the sense of human dignity could not allow them to accept as fellow men, this fright of something like oneself that still under no circumstances ought to be like ourself, remained at the basis of slavery, and behold, this is what it's about, that's Schmitt's editorial insertion, because the basis for race society, namely the Boers in South Africa. Hannah Arendt, The Burden of Our Time. The Burden of Our Time is the UK title in the 1950s, so also books have often, sometimes multiple titles across the Atlantic divide, you could say, and The Origins of Totalitarianism was first published as The Burden of Our Time when it's published in the UK. Thus, and this is Schmitt continuing, thus in 1848, the learned European of that time, Bruno Bauer, saw the, at that time, emancipated ghetto Jews, end quote. Surveying Schmitt's engagement with Arendt in his diaries, letters, and published writings, let us pay close attention to dating and to chronology for reasons which should become clear. In a letter dated 10 November 1953, Schmitt writes to Winfried Martini, quote, on this theme, I must still ask you whether you're acquainted with the book by Hannah Arendt, Origins of Totalitarianism, in the UK edition, the English edition, The Burden of Our Time. It is for your theme on the whole, as well as in particular, so significant for this question of democracy and Jewishness, Judentum, so unheard of significant that I must mention it here and ask whether it was not good to cite it. I possess it and can lend it to you, end quote. The evidence from Schmitt's library catalog, so the collection of books that Schmitt has in his library when he dies, confirms that Schmitt both possessed and annotated Arendt's work in the 1951 edition of The Origins of Totalitarianism, published in the United Kingdom as The Burden of Our Time. In a joint letter, and this is citation 17 on your handout, in a joint letter from his daughter Anima and from Carl Schmitt, so Anima Schmitt and Carl Schmitt to Nikolaus Sombart, this is the son of the sociologist Werner Sombart, dated 8 September 1951, Schmitt writes to the younger Sombart, quote, in which publishing house, i.e. with which publisher, has Hannah Arendt, Origins, i.e. Origins of Totalitarianism, appeared? I recall still with admiration both your presentations, first on the first part of the book by Hannah Arendt, and second on the letter of the old Demestre to the young Ballanche, end quote, and that's citation 17 on your handout. This letter bears the same date, so if you compare 17 with 15, this letter bears the same date as the first of Schmitt's diary entries on Arendt, 8 September 1951. In other words, if you go back to citation 15, Schmitt has classed Arendt among the ghetto Jews as a poor, lost emancipado before he has even purchased her book. Schmitt's interpolation of his adversaries as Jews precedes his engagement with their writings, i.e. he has identified her as an enemy before he's read the text. For Schmitt, racialized confessional categorization precedes interpretation, and the categorization of writers into groups of enemies and friends precedes actual reading, both in Schmitt's political polemics as well as in his histories of thought. While militarily, Schmitt turns the weapons of his enemies against those enemies themselves, juridically, Schmitt's strategy amounts to securing the testimony of the accused in a self-incriminating manner, forcing conviction by testimonial self-incrimination. This strategy, as it were, taking the weapons of the enemy, turning those weapons on the enemy themselves, this strategy reflects Schmitt's forensic rhetoric, his forensic rhetoric, and his deep self-understanding and deep training as a jurist, as a lawyer. Schmitt, who regards conviction by the self-incriminating testimony of one's opponent as not the least potent strategy in a well-equipped rhetorical arsenal, favors this mode of treating those he would put on trial and those he would persecute. To sum up, in conclusion, so you've made it through the first two parts of the talk. To sum up in conclusion, in writing about figures in the history of political thought, and in writing political or world history more broadly, Schmitt is not aiming to recount the past or the thought of the past as that thought or as that past actually occurred. Schmitt is rather doing politics, Schmitt's own politics in his own time, with the Polemarchian aim of helping his friends and harming his enemies. Where Schmitt's friends are figures and stalking horses for his own opinions, and his enemies are those he would vanquish and those whom he would annihilate. In the next lecture, we'll look at the varying views of freedom offered by Carl Schmitt and Raymond Aron, before turning in the final lecture to a contrasting portrait of Schmitt and Aron's views on geopolitics and on foreign policy. Thank you.
About half an hour for discussion, I think.
So is there any sort of explicit self-reflection that is what he's doing? Probably wouldn't say something like that publicly, but like in his private correspondence or something like that.
So it's with things like, with the claim that concepts and terms of art, political vocabulary is weaponry, that's explicit in Concept of Political, that's a direct quote. In terms of doing this, I mean, it's a kind of Ciceronian strategy, right? So, which, it's a kind of, you can think of it as almost a pan-European inheritance, but Schmitt's a master of it. Schmitt's not alone in that way in the history of political thought. Francis Bacon also uses the same, you can think of that as the same rhetorical strategy, and because it's a strategy of ancient rhetoric. I think it's pretty explicit that that's what he's doing. But I don't think he doesn't necessarily always come out and say, oh, I'm going to plagiarize English histories of piracy to show that the English people, by their own testimony, are pirates, right? So he's, just quoting Philip Gossa, even without saying that he's doing. He says, look, they say it themselves, they're pirates, right? It's in their histories, their national histories, their histories of piracy. I think that one can take that as something that he has from a kind of rich Jesuit training in the classics. I don't know if that speaks to your thought, or?
Yes, also just how he views his role in analyzing political thought as sort of purely political as opposed to sort of historical, as we would see historical.
Right, and I suppose also the thought is that the analysis can never be clefted from politics, right? So that insofar as the analysis bears upon the political thing to be constructed, the political thing to be talked about, and it has the potential for leading to violence, you can't cleft the politics out of the political analysis. So that, our view of kind of pure analysis isn't Schmitt's view. So in other words, Schmitt agrees with the view, you could say, that contemporary writers say the political is political, but in some sense, the view that nothing is outside the political, at least potentially, right? So it's a modification of the view that everything is political. Everything for Schmitt is at least potentially political, including what we might call political analysis. And if that speaks to the.
I was just hearing you talking about this notion of what cannot quite be justified in his opportunism, and then trying to read that back into your sort of non-definition of political theology. And I thought maybe that political theology means that there is a truth beyond the truth that can be handled in discourse with reference to norms, so that you claim reference to something that legitimizes you, but this thing is not something that you can justify in a discourse in words. And if that's true, then you don't need revelation. So what's theological about political theology is just that it is verification from sense.
And can you just say that the point again about the reference to norms?
Yeah, well, if you can't in a discourse in language articulate why this other truth is true, then of course it also cannot. It's sort of modus bonus. It cannot also be measured against other norms, right? Because norms are something that figure as justifications within discourse.
Yeah. So I suppose that for Schmitt, the question that then becomes, in some sense, what is the locus of norms, or what's the derivation of norms? Where do norms come from, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do they come, in a kind of Habermasian way, come from the discourse situation itself, come out of us talking to one another that genders raises up norms, or do they come from above, right? And Schmitt, in the Habilitation, he argues that they come from above, so that norms come from God. And as an early Schmitt, it's not a Schmitt, on the precept of, it's not a Schmitt that Schmitt himself repeats so much. He republished, the book is 1914, also republished in 1917, partially because he has to republish it as a condition of the Habilitation. So there's a necessity to that. But Schmitt says, well, what is a norm? Not a command. So he's not a command theorist of law, and so not like Baudin or Hobbes, right? So where the sovereign says do it, but a commandment, and he means the Ten Commandments, die Gebote, so not Befehl, Gebot, would be the contrast, but so Zehn Gebote is in the background of that. So the thought for Schmitt, at least the norms that are divine norms. Jus divinum is real use for Schmitt, also in the Habilitation.
No, sorry, just one follow-up. So but that cannot be squared perhaps with his opportunistic historicism, right? Because if things are true only once, well, the Ten Commandments are true always. So then you need a cast of priests, political priests, to interpret why the universal norms are different in every case.
Yeah, so I think you do need that for Schmitt. And this is also, for Schmitt, the claim is also, if you go back to the first page of the handout that's not the cartoon page, the first page, and this is citations 5 and 6, is that in historical truth is only true once. So that the interpretive problem for trying to understand Schmitt would be trying to say, well, for Schmitt, there are historical truths and non-historical truths, right? So, the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt or the administration of Stalin in the Soviet Union, those would be historical facts, right? And those are relativizable. But something like, love thy neighbor as thyself, as opposed to eat thy neighbor as thyself, that would be a non-historical or trans-historical truth or trans-historical proposition that you couldn't make eat thy neighbor as thyself into a generalizable law. That would be, for Schmitt, that would be a trans-historical proposition. So that it's no longer something that's only true once, but more persistently or enduringly so. But then precisely, one needs the worldly instance, whether from Pope or from papal sanctioned authority, and one thinks then also in the papal concordances, which Mussolini and Hitler get, one needs that to determine, in the particular historical case, what it means to love thy neighbor as thyself, as opposed to eat thy neighbor as thyself.
Mm-hmm.
Did Carl Schmitt have many friends?
It depends on what you mean by friend. It depends what, So the question is, if you think about, were there other Carl Schmitt? So if the friend is another me, right? In the Aristotelian definition, well, it seems to be also there is only one Schmitt. But Schmitt had many students who also wrote many things, including Ernst Rudolf Huber, who's a German lawyer, constitutional lawyer, and constitutional historian, but also Ernst Forsthoff, who's a theorist of the total state, but also post 1945 German constitutional lawyer and German law professor. So Schmitt had many students who persisted in keeping some aspects of Schmittian thought. So the question is, okay, what's the definition of friendship? It would depend on your definition of friendship. But you could also have people who share things, and it also, Schmitt was apparently a very generous person with people that he knew. He would come to someone's house with flowers, with gifts. So that, there was a hospitality to the human Schmitt. Yeah. But Schmitt also regarded whole classes of people and whole nations as his enemies. So just to give an example of that, Ellen Kennedy, who's the translator of the book that's translated as The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy, she once told me that when she visited Schmitt, so Schmitt was still alive when she was translating the Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy, so the German title is Die geistesgeschichtliche Lage des heutigen Parlamentarismus. The German title would be better translated as The Intellectual Historical Situation of Contemporary Parliamentarism. Right, so but obviously you can't publish that. Even MIT Press wouldn't make any money with that title. So you have to translate it as Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy, and no one wants intellectual history. Everyone hates it, right? So you can't have it in the title. So that has to go out. But rather, Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy. So she was in correspondence with Schmitt, and she was Ellen Kennedy's American by origin, but she was at the University of York when she was doing it, when she was doing the translation, and so she was corresponding with Schmitt on York University letterhead. And when she went to visit Schmitt in Plettenberg, in the Rhineland, in his house while he's still alive, in his 90s, he put on the record of Rule Britannia as she walked in the house, right? So it's a kind of act of hospitality, thinking that she was British, not that she was an American, right? So the British person, what do they want? They want to rule. And so they should have Rule Britannia as they enter my home, even if they're my enemy. So that's it would be a kind of example of Schmittian hospitality. So really going toward the other, right? So kind of a movement toward the other. That's Ellen Kennedy's story. I mean, so she blurbed the landed sea before, so yeah. I don't know if that's.
Well, would it be ironic?
Well, right. So I guess it's still kind of it's an approach to the enemy as other, but as the human, mediated through a national identity or perceived national identity. It can be false, it can be a misrecognition, a case of mistaken identity. But even then, he's pre-reading the person through their nationality or through what he thinks is their nationality. Someone teaching at the University of York has to be British, even if she's an American.
I suppose my question is really, are there echoes of his thinking that resonate today, and how that's...
Yeah, and so that can also, right, so there's, so that's a big, I suppose, so Schmitt has a great reception, and one thinks that in this great university, Faisal Devji is a great representative of that, and Frida Zaman is at the far end of the table. There are, wonderful people and great researchers in this university and in Cambridge. Shruti Kapila is another example of that. There are great researchers throughout the world who have taken up Schmitt's thought in all kinds of directions. There's Schmittian Marxism, Schmittian Maoism, Alain Badiou, but there's also in subaltern studies and post-colonial theory, many appropriations of Schmitt. And I think some of the most interesting work, both in the history of political thought and in contemporary political theory, is done by people who are thinking with Schmitt. Right? So that'd be an example. But even going back to your earlier question, so that in this kind of separate question, also, but Schmitt writes and dedicates books to friends. And that's especially true of some of the late books. So a number of the late books, you could even think of the last 3 books are all gifts to friends, which he probably wouldn't otherwise have published. That's a Mehring interpretation from the Mehring biography. But Mehring says, well, the last 3 books, that's Tyranny of Values, that is Theory of the Partisan, and that's Political Theology 2. So it sounds like a Star Wars title, Return of the Political Theology 2. That's the last book in 1970. Political Theology 2 is dedicated, and this goes back to Radar's good question, Political Theology 2 is dedicated to a canon lawyer. So Schmitt dedicates the last book, so it goes to the question of the priests. It's dedicated to a canon lawyer, a Nazi canon lawyer, who opposes Vatican II, and Schmitt says kind of the send-off, the final send-off is to such a lawyer, so to a priest. The last book is dedicated to a priest, worth keeping in mind, and a friend, a close friend of Schmitt. The book before that is dedicated to Ernst Forsthoff, his former PhD student who wrote A Defense of the Total State in 1933. But this is a book from 1963, dedicated to Forsthoff, The Theory of the Partisan. And effectively the claim is, you too, like me, you're a guerrilla fighter against the American-British occupying authorities, against the colonial oppression that we experience in Germany in the Federal Republic. So Schmitt doesn't regard the Federal Republic as a state, right? So the state, if it's a political unity of people, the German people in 1963, but also from 1945 to the end of Schmitt's life, the German people are divided, right? They're not united, right? They're divided by, from Schmitt's perspective, the Soviet occupiers and the American, British, French occupiers, the liberal occupiers and the Soviet occupiers, and that Germany is not a state. And so the Federal Republic actually fails Schmitt's definition of what a state is. So he doesn't even regard himself as a citizen of the Federal Republic because the Federal Republic isn't even a state. And so he regards it as a kind of colonial administration via the British, the Americans, and the French. But he dedicates, also dedications to friends, going back to your point about friends, he dedicates the second to last book to another former Nazi lawyer, the very last book to a Nazi priest, and the book before that to seminar adherents who go to the seminar in Ebrach, which is a kind of summer school where former Nazi lawyers give talks and future German lawyers hear the talks. And Bernhard Schlink, the author of Der Vorleser, was at those events in the early 1960s. And Tyranny of Values is dedicated to the Erbracher who heard his lecture version of the Tyranny of Values. So it's all the people who were in the seminar, kind of secret seminar for former Nazis and future German lawyers. But those are all, in effect, future, so they're all dedications to friends. So they're kind of the last ones. You could even think of the last book as letters to friends, friendly letters. Ad familiaris. So kind of also Ciceronian strategy, going back to the very first question. I can take whoever was first.
Talking about Schmitt's friends, and without getting that much into content, but how did his friendship with Ernst Jünger develop, bearing in mind that it seems that Schmitt's friendship to the National Socialist regime was far more closer and supportive, even theoretically, than Ernst Jünger, who both rejected it theoretically and in his own way.
Yeah, so Jünger and Schmitt have a correspondence. The extant correspondence between Schmitt and Jünger runs from 1930 or 1931 up until 1983, and it breaks in 83. The last letter of Junger to Schmitt, Junger mentions that Schmidt's daughter, Anima, who's his only child, has passed away, and then and he expresses his condolences, his apology, and Schmitt doesn't answer the letter. And a lot of the Schmitt correspondences, even though Schmitt dies in 85, a lot of the correspondences break in 83. So Schmitt, it would then be, in effect, he's 94, 95, or I guess he's 94 turning 95 in 83, because he's an 1888 birth, July 1888 birth. So in 83, he's 94 turning 95. And then he stops answering his correspondence. But it's a long correspondence with Ernst Junger. It's not the longest, but it's one of the longest. Schmitt contributes, along with Heidegger and other writers, to Junger's 60th birthday Festschrift, which is edited by Armin Mohler, and that title goes back to the previous question. The title of the Festschrift for Junger when Junger turns 60. So Junger was born in 1895 and lives to 1998. So I mean, a good lesson you could take from the Nazi writers, you could say, well, not all of them smoked, including Leni Riefenstahl, right? Leni Riefenstahl lives till 2003, right? So amazing. So these don't smoke. Don't smoke cigarettes. It's bad for you. The Nazi lawyers and the Nazi directors, they didn't smoke. They lived a really long time. Junger lived to be 102. He would have been 103 in the year that he died, right? So, but Schmitt, the title of the Festschrift, going back to the previous question, is Friendly Encounters. So, and Schmitt contributes to that, right? So it's a friendly. It is also Heidegger, other people who have dubious pasts, to take the title of one of the books about Junger by Elliot Niemann. Dubious past, both Schmitt and Junger. Junger is a more complicated case, but Junger is the cultural attaché to the Nazi embassy in Nazi-occupied Paris, right? You don't get that job by being nonpartisan, let's say. And so also Junger invites Schmitt to give one of the versions of, an early version of draft part of the text of Land and Sea in 40-41, from the Nazi embassy for Schmitt to go to Paris to give the talk. So that's a kind of also kind of dubious relation. There are both in both Junger and in Schmitt you can find criticisms of Nazi policy. From Schmitt's side, some of the criticisms of Nazi policy look like the Nazis aren't doing enough to do the atrocities. The things that we regard as the worst parts of Nazism. Schmitt's like, well, you're actually not doing that fast enough, or it was a mistake to invade the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa is a catastrophe. It's a violation of international law because that's going to defeat our whole movement. So I mean, and Schmitt is a critic of certain aspects of Nazi policy, but from the vantage of the success of that the Nazi policies that he's critical of are inhibiting Nazi aims, right? And there's an aspect of that in Junger as well. So if you read Das Abenteuerliche Herz, The Adventurous Heart, by Junger, it's a series of aphorisms, partially what you could imagine something like Berryman poems in a way, dream songs in a certain sense. These are Junger's kind of Nazi dream songs, and one of the passages has Junger. He says, "I'm sitting in a cafe. Underneath me is a torture chamber. I'm drinking my my coffee. It's okay, right? So and that's so that's the kind that's the level of as it were, non-partisanship, as it were, by Junger. Right? So it's not as extreme as Schmitt justifying the Nuremberg laws, justifying deportations, justifying Nazi empire in the writings themselves, but it's not exactly resistance fighting. Yeah.
So I kind of want to have a follow-up to Royce's question, which is, how exactly did Schmitt regard Junger's political thinking? Because my understanding is that Junger took a far more individualistic approach to his understanding of what it means to be like right-wing, right? You have a concept of the anarch and things like this, where I think Schmitt's kind of a lot more collectivist. And so I was wondering if over the 50 years of correspondence they had any significant, philosophical or theoretical exchanges or disputes.
Great. So it's directly related to the last two questions. So going back to this Junger Festschrift, which you see in a way it's the closest point of contact, right? Schmitt's a contributor, like Heidegger, to Junger's 60th birthday Festschrift, which is entitled Friendly Encounters, Freundschaftliche Begegnungen. And the way that book is organized is it's organized by Junger texts. So each contributor writes on a Junger book. Heidegger's contribution is on Über die Linie, over the line. Schmidt's contribution is on Junger's Der Gordischen Knoten, the Gordian knot. And the Gordian knot is a text from the early 50s. It's the book after Der Waldgang, about the forest passage, is the English translation. But as you can say, the forest path is also, the path of the forest is also kind of path of resistance. And in that book, to give me two images. One image is Junger gives the image, and it's a kind of anti-Faulkner. It's right after Faulkner has won the Nobel Prize for Literature. So Junger and also Schmitt, there's a lot of jokes in both, and this is a point of contact. It goes back to the last 2 points. Point of contact, Junger and Schmitt know that they're not going to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, right? They know that. Who wins the Nobel Prize for Literature in the early 1950s? Winston Churchill, right? And they're like, no, we don't have a chance, right? We don't have a chance. They, and so they make fun of the winners of the Nobel Prize, and it's kind of running line. But who wins? It's late 40s. I think it's 48 or 49. I don't have a computer to look it up, but Faulkner wins, and there are many images in Faulkner's novels, including in Absalom, of people staying in burning houses. The house is on fire, and people go down with their house. They immolate themselves with their house. And Junger has its clear aphorism at the end of the Forest Passage. Junger says, "Your house is on fire. You walk out of the house." You walk out of the house. It's a kind of anti-Faulknerian image. There's another image at the end of the Forest Passage where Junger says, look, I can imagine Jewish people when the Nazis came to take them away. I imagine a young Jewish man. He gives a kind of historical case of a Jewish man who takes out a gun and starts shooting at the Nazis when they come to take him away. And Junger says, that's the right thing to do. And we should think about that now in the early 1950s, where we too are under occupation, right? So, and that's a point of contact with Schmitt, right? And that's the book right before the Gordian knot. But in the Gordian knot, Junger's like, well, the Soviet Union's pretty bad. The Soviet Union's pretty bad, and we should resist them. And the Americans, they're equally bad as the Soviet Union, but not quite so bad. And so you can actually pit the West against the East. And the East is the Soviet Union, that's worse. And the West, it's bad, but it's not that bad. And Schmitt's contribution to Junger's Festschrift is a critique of that book and of that view. And Schmitt says, look, East-West, that's a bunch of nonsense. If I go far enough to the West, I end up again in the East, right? The world is a globe, right? This East-West stuff is nonsense, and Junger is wrong about this. So his contribution to Junger's Festschrift is direct attack. It's a direct critique of Junger. It's a friendly encounter, but it's like, look, friend, you're wrong. And what would be better than East and West? Land and sea. So, and this is 1955, right? And it's going back to the 1942 position. It's like, Junger, the Forest Passage, that was better. Der Waldgang, good. You were on the land, you were on the soil. That's a landed view, good. But the Gordian knot, that's a mistake. So that's a kind of, if you want the kind of the core of it would be to read the Gordian knot by Junger and read Schmidt's contribution to Freundschaftliche Begegnungen, which is on the contemporary world dichotomy between East and West, notes on Ernst Junger's Gordian knot, i.e. why it's wrong. And so it's also a kind of restatement of Land and Sea, which then also funnels into the dialogue on New Space. The dialogue on New Space, you could say, is the kind of dialogue or dramatic presentation of what one gets in that contribution. And you actually get, this goes back to Radar's question at the very outset, the place where Schmitt says in his own voice that in historical truth is only true once is in that contribution to the Junger Festschrift. So if you go back to citation 5 and 6, citation 5 gives the dialogue form version where Altmann, who's Schmidt's spokesperson, says, and historical truth is only true once. The next quotation is Schmitt in his own voice, after critiquing Junger for this East-West stuff, goes on to say, and historical truth is only true once, and that's total nonsense about East and West. I don't know if yeah, Moise, yeah.
So, what's the relationship that Schmitt has, or his political theology has to the idea of the transcendental? We generally think of him as a theorist of immanence. You're saying that he gives you this, there is this reference to norms or law, which is not command, but commandment, which comes from above. But I'm wondering whether this law, this divine law, plays a structuring role in his political theology. And I have in mind right here Rousseau, with whom, of course, there's this affinity that he shares that against representation or Obsidian representation, they kind of premise their project on democratic identity. But in Rousseau, at least, there's something called this question: how does the multitude transform itself into a people? And then Rousseau gives you this divine surrogate law-giving outsider, foreigner figure. wonder, I mean, so I'm just wondering, like, in Schmitt, there is this exceptionality to political theology, that the sovereign is the one who decides upon the exception. That gives you the modern executive. Why can't the sovereign also be the one who makes the fundamental law in the legislature? So that's one. And another related issue is regarding Arendt. Is it just a personal animosity, or does he also say something conceptually about her? Because what I have in mind is the definition of law that they are working with. I mean, of course, Schmitt, as you refer to, No More of the Earth, law primarily, first and foremost, is a land grab. And in Arendt, it's lex. It's not so much a land grab, but rather a contract. And that translates into politics, into action in concert. But Arendt does, and there's some references to Schmitt in Arendt's corpus, and she wrestles with this normal stuff, and then just brackets it off, and just says, oh, this is pre-political, economic, I mean, it's just before the polity and the constitution comes into being, but the actual arena of politics is all about action in concept. So I'm just wondering if, it's also a bit more conceptual rather than just personal.
Right. So if you go, great question, Moise. I'll take the second part first on the personal animosity question. I mean, I think it's group animosity, not personal animosity for Arendt, right? So he's reading Arendt as a species of a genus, let's say, and he even uses male pronouns to describe her because der Jude is gendered masculine, it's masculine noun, right? He refers to her effectively as the Jew, right, der Jude, but then that makes it also por los emancipado, right? So even when he's talking about her in Spanish, right, he refers to her with a masculine noun. And so as it were group animosity applied to the particular case, let's say. But at the conceptual level, I mean, I think that there's a question. Obviously, our Arendt studies and Arendt interpretation is an industry vaster. Yet, if there's any industry that is more vast than Schmitt studies, it's Arendt studies. But you could say, well, what's Arendt's defense? Let's say defense of liberalism or defense of the Western political tradition set over and against, let's say, the Soviet Union. And we might think of Arendt as being kind of Nietzschean. In this, where one thought of Nietzsche is to really justify something or defend something, you take the whole of the thing, its good aspects and its bad aspects, and you juxtapose the worst instance of the thing, and you say, well, even that, you affirm the whole. So it's a total affirmation. And you might actually think about Arendt's structure, the structure of Arendt's defense, both in Origins of Totalitarianism, but also in her political writings. Even if you look at things that people don't want to talk about, like Reflections on Little Rock or other texts, Arendt's claims is effectually, it's better to be the worst, you can put it in Rawlsian terms, it's better to be the worst off person in Mississippi than to be the worst off person in North Korea, something like this. Right? I mean, it's a harsh view. But even here, what's he doing? If we go to 15 and also going on down to 16, Schmitt is using the South African case. And in a way, he's doing what the first questioner aptly drew out. He's drawing out aspects of what that strategy means. Is it really better to be the worst off person in South Africa in 1952 than it is to be the worst off person in North Korea or in Mao's China in 1952? That's the conceptual counter. But the conceptual counter is being run through this aspect of testimonial self-incrimination, and he's using, as it were, Arendt's claim against herself. I don't know if that would be my response. If does that speak to that part of the question? That was the second part of your question. The first part of your question is about transcendence and transcendent authority. And the aspects of this come from Schmitt's Habilitation, so from The Value of the State, Der Wert des Staates, which is a book from 1914. And that's structured, it's a three-part treatise. So Schmitt likes these triadic structures. That's true also of the State, Movement, People from 1933. The three types of juristic thought or three types of juristic thinking. So Schmitt likes triads or trinities in his arguments in the structures of his books. The Value of the State has three substantive chapters, an introduction and then three substantive chapters. The first chapter is on law and power, the second chapter is on the state, and the third chapter is on the individual. In the first chapter, Schmitt says, well, are norms made by immanent powers? And Schmitt's answer, surprisingly, is no. right? You wouldn't actually, in kind of the pop view of Schmitt, you wouldn't actually think that Schmitt would be saying that, but that's what he argues for in that first chapter of his second kind of qualifying text, kind of second thesis, Habilitation. He argues, no, norms are independent of worldly power. They're not independent of the power of God, but God stands above the worldly powers. And it goes back to Radar's good question. In effect, they're coming from a higher place. We can, love thy neighbor as thyself. That's coming from a higher place. It's not something. The worldly powers can't. There are limits to what the worldly powers can legislate, right? And Schmitt is actually open. There's a very wide space of that. But the worldly powers can't legislate, say, cannibalism. They can't legislate, eat thy neighbor as thyself. So the question. So I guess also in this aspect, there is an aspect of secularization in the political theology. But the question is whether. The question of the paper here is whether that the secularization aspect fully defines or fully takes up Schmitt's meaning by political theology. And Schmitt does think of the worldly sovereign as in effect then modeled on the omnipotent power of God who gives a jus divinum, who gives a divine law. And Schmitt says the divine law is real law. It's a use, not a lex. I don't know, Moise, if that speaks to the first aspect of your question?
Yes. So basically the worldly sovereign is just defining the exception incapable of giving us the law? Is that what you're trying to say? That
And
the divine law just operates by itself and what the sovereign does is decide upon the exception?
It goes back to Radar's question, the second question earlier, which is effectively there has to be a kind of worldly class that gives content to what it means to love, if you're my neighbor, I have to love you as myself, right? What does that mean in the particular case, right? Does it mean I swerve left or swerve right with my car when we're going to have a head-on collision? That's going to be a decision of the worldly law. But that I don't eat you, right? And you don't eat me, right? This the worldly power has to. There are, as it were, limits. There are limits to the aleatory aspect of the law for Schmitt.
Yeah, sure.
My question is about the divine revelation or divine law that's in Ephesians 2 and 3. How do you know what is divine revelation? Is it just as what's in the Bible, or?
I think for Schmitt, so there could be, a miracle, right? That's also an aspect that comes down in the miracle is the state of the exception has an aspect of being the miracle. But for Schmitt, there's a Schmitt aphorism in the glossarium where Schmitt says, I read modern philosophy and Heidegger tells me that the human is the shepherd of being. And I read the Bible, and the Bible tells me the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And I ask myself, what should I believe, the Bible or modern philosophy, right? So, but in Schmitt, the implication of the kind of joke, or the bad joke, you could say, is he shouldn't believe Heidegger. Right? So in other words, the claim is coming from the Ten Commandments, right? Or what we have in the Bible, the Christian Bible. There are also, so I don't know if does that answer your question? So you could have direct revelation, but Schmitt's view of institutions isn't really such that you would have that, or any of us would have that really. But the priestly class would have access to that, or have the best knowledge of that. So it is a kind of defense of clericalism. I don't know if it speaks to the question. Yeah.
Just kind of a biographical point on Schmitt's commitment to genuine belief in God and stuff like this. My understanding is he was excommunicated by the Catholic Church for bigamy. Yeah, for
extramarital concubinage.
And how did his excommunication from the Catholic Church? I think quite early on. He
opposes his own excommunication. That's worth noting. He opposes it in canon law. So he doesn't want, and he thinks actually that's an odd. This is a genuine kind of paradox of the position. Schmitt thinks that the Pope is infallible, and he says that. That goes back to Moise's point as well, and to Radar's point about priestly mediation of the divine law. Schmitt says that the Pope is infallible. He says that both in Roman Catholicism and political form, which precedes his excommunication, but the excommunication is also lifted when the extramarital concubinage ends, because his second secular wife passes away from cancer in the early 1950s, then the excommunication is lifted. Right? So Schmitt both opposed the excommunication. He didn't think he should have been excommunicated in the beginning. When the extramarital concubinage ceases, he goes back into the church. And he's buried by a bishop. So he has a church funeral. Right? So he has a church burial.
Was he actually devoutly religious? Did he attend church on Sunday?
He attends. So if you should read the Mehring biography on this. Schmitt attends church while in, so also Mering is very interested also in Schmidt's personal life, the details of which perhaps shouldn't or need not concern us. But so the extramarital concubinage that is official is with the second wife, that he gets married a second time when the church does not grant him an annulment on his first marriage, although the civil power grants him a divorce. While being married the second time, his second wife is not his only partner, let's say, and Schmitt with both his marital partners and his non-marital partners goes to church. So Schmitt goes to church both with those whom he is married to and those with whom he is not married. And there are many descriptions of this, perhaps excessively graphic, and that was one of the things for which the Mering biography was criticized. Coming out of Schmitt's diaries, Mering relays at detail what Schmitt's both churchly and extra-churchly relations with his marital and extramarital partners.
But how did he kind of square that with then the divine providence of law, let's say? And how did that influence then his thinking in his public writings, right? Like how does he square, the shortcomings in his own personal life and the problems he literally has with the church and the kind of well, the Pope is infallible, but I oppose the infallibility of the Pope.
Right.
With then his public writing of, political theology. How does that?
Yeah, so in some sense, you could also say, I think you could in your own, it creates also paradoxes with the issue of private conscience, which Dr. Malcolm mentioned at the outset of the last set of questions in the first lecture. It is a problem for Schmitt's political theology, but Schmitt doesn't ever say, even while he disagrees with his excommunication, he doesn't go into print, let's say, with his thought that the church authorities are making a mistake in his case. Right, so you can also think about that in terms of, you could think about that in Hobbesian terms, right? So that Hobbes can disagree with the policy of, say, Charles I, whether on ship money or on making Stafford, elevating Stafford to some post. Hobbes can disagree with that, but he's not going to go into print and say that. Right, so in other words, the critique of the sovereign, you keep that quiet, right? And critique, even if you think that the infallible instance is making a very worldly, fallible mistake, you are silent about it. So that's I think that's a point where actually you can read Schmitt in Hobbesian terms, and maybe it's helpful. I don't know if that speaks to the thought.
Yeah, it makes sense also in the context of when he says, when you have democracy and you're on the losing side, you have to take a Rousseauian position of just well, maybe I'm wrong and I have to shut up and take it.
Right, and he takes the excommunication for more than 25 years. Even though it's not, but even while he's excommunicated, and that's I suppose the interpretive issue in scholarship is, while he's excommunicated, he doesn't downplay papal infallibility. Indeed, this goes back to some of the questions from at the end of the first lecture, going back to the good question about the Renaissance humanists from last time. And the response to that was also something like, well, if you look at Schmitt's writings in the 1940s, during his excommunication, he's saying, what is good international law? The Treaty of Tordesillas, which the Argentine junta also invokes in the wars with Britain in the 1980s. The Argentine junta invokes the Treaty of Tordesillas to claim the Falkland Islands, right? So Schmitt and the Argentine junta are appealing to the same source and saying that's good international law. But that is a papal declaration, it's a papal decree, right? Saying, just dividing the line, saying, look, Brazil, here's a line. Brazil, Portugal has that, and Argentina, they have that, right? Spain has this, right? So what will later become Argentina, Spain has it, and that's what the Argentine junta in the 1980s is appealing to in the United Nations, and what Schmitt, even during his excommunication, is saying in print, right? So he's still praising papal authority. That doesn't get downplayed, and if that. Other questions? Maybe I didn't see all hands. Or
did he write about Henry VIII?
So he writes more about Elizabeth, and in Land and Sea, sections 7 and 8. So also the question of for Schmitt, I can even get the Land and Sea out. What does he say about Elizabeth? So that's also, I don't think he mentions Henry VIII. Well, because that's also it's relevant, and also to speak to excellent Oxford historians. Lucy Wooding, for example, at Lincoln College, Oxford, in her history of the Tudor monarchs, what's the crucial date for the Reformation? For Lucy Wooding's history, it's not a 1530s date, it's a 1550s date. it's 1558, right? Because there are two Reformations, right? And that's also true for Gaida, for many of the great early modern historians at this great university. What's the crucial date for both Gaida and for Lucy Wooding? It's 1558, because England becomes Catholic again in the 1550s under Mary Tudor, right? So the world historical event isn't the 1530s. It's not the first Reformation, it's the second, because the second sticks. And so what does Schmitt say? The world historical consciousness of the English monarchs, whether Queen Elizabeth or the Stuarts, James and Charles, and the English statesmen of this period was not different from that of most of their contemporaries. So he omits Henry VIII, right? He omits it from Land and Sea, right? The crucial one is Elizabeth. It's the re-Reformation, the founding of the founding that sticks is 1558. So in that way, you can think. So Lucy Wooding's great history of Tudor Britain can help us see what Schmitt is arguing in Land and Sea. I don't know if that speaks to your question. So I think Henry VIII is not in Land and Sea, and that's also true. Also Hobbes and Plato are not in, because their view doesn't stick.
Yeah, that's probably guessing because of Henry VIII's marriage and the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
The same sort of.
Yeah, but great question, and it's also one of the things where world historical writings or writings about world history, whether Hegel or Schmitt, it's helpful both to know what's in it, but also what's out of it. And world history itself, as a genre, functions as a kind of exclusive genre. If you don't mention the thing in your world history, you're effectively saying the thing is not of world historical importance. Yeah. And Schmitt is, I think, in effect, doing that with Henry VIII, and actually saying, in effect, also that 1558 is the more important date for the Reformation. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.